The following is a conversation with James Holland, a historian specializing in World War II, who has written a lot of amazing books on the subject, especially covering the Western Front, often providing fascinating details at multiple levels of analysis, including strategic, operational, tactical, technological, and of course the human side, the personal accounts from the war. He also co-hosts a great podcast on World War II called We Have Ways of Making You Talk. This is a Lex Friedman podcast. To support it, please check out our sponsors in the description or at lexfriedman.com/sponsors. And now, dear friends, here's James Holland. In Volume 1 of The War in the West, your book series on World War II, you write, the Second World War witnessed the deaths of more than 60 million people from over 60 different countries. Entire cities were laid waste. National borders were redrawn, and many millions more people found themselves displaced. Over the past couple of decades, many of those living in the Middle East or parts of Africa, the Balkans, Afghanistan, and even the United States may feel justifiably that these troubled times have already proved the most traumatic in their recent past. Yet, globally, the Second World War was and remains the single biggest catastrophe of modern history. In terms of human drama, it is unrivaled. No other war has affected so many lives in such a large number of countries. So, what to you makes World War II the biggest catastrophe in human drama in modern history? And maybe from a historian perspective, the most fascinating subject to study?
The thing about World War II is it really is truly global. You know, it's fought in deserts, it's fought in the Arctic, it's fought across oceans, it's fought in the air, it's in jungle, it's in the hills. It is on the beaches. It's also on the Russian steppe, and it's also in Ukraine. So it's that global nature of it. And I just think, you know, where there's war, there is always incredible human drama. And I think for most people, and certainly the true in my case, you get drawn to the human drama of it. It's that thought that, you know, gosh, if I'd been 20 years old, how would I have dealt with it? You know, would I have been in the army? Would I have been in the Air Force? Would I have been on a, Royal Navy destroyer? Or, how would I have coped with it? And how would I have dealt with that separation? I mean, I've interviewed people who were away for 4 years. I remember talking to a tank man from Liverpool in England called Sam Bradshaw. And he went away for 4 years. And when he came home, he'd been twice wounded. He'd been very badly wounded in North Africa. And then he was shot in the neck in Italy, eventually got home. And when he came home, his mother had turned grey. His little baby sister, who had been, 13 when he left, was now a young woman. His old school had been destroyed by Luftwaffe bombs. He didn't recognize the place. And do you know what he did? He joined up again. Went back out of Europe and was one of the first people in Belsen. So,
What was his justification for that, for joining right back?
He just felt completely disconnected to home. He felt that the gulf of time, his experiences had separated him from all the normalities of life. And he felt that the normalities of the life that he had known before he'd gone away to war had just been severed in a really kind of cruel way that he didn't really feel he was able to confront at that particular point. But he decided to rejoin, couldn't go back to the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, so went back to a different unit, went from kind of the Italian campaign to European theatre. Didn't see so much action at the end, but, like a lot of British troops, if you were in a certain division at a certain time, you ended up passing very close to Belsen and, you suddenly realized, okay, this was the right thing to do. We did have to get rid of Nazism. We did have to do this because this is the consequence. It's not just the oppression. It's just not just the secret police. It's not just the expansionism of Nazism. It is also, the Holocaust, which hadn't been given its name at that point. But you're witnessing this kind of untold cruelty. And I always, I've always sort of, I think a lot about Sam. I mean, he's no longer with us, but he was one of the kind of first people that I interviewed, and I interviewed him at great length. And I know you like a long interview, Lex, and I totally get that, because when you have a long interview, you really start getting to the nuts and bolts of it. One of the frustrations for me when I'm looking at oral histories of Second World War vets is usually they're kind of, they're put on YouTube or they're put on a museum website. They're 30 minutes, an hour if you're lucky, and you're just scratching the surface. You never really get to know it, and you feel that they're just repeating kind of stuff they've read in books themselves after the war and stuff. And I was kind of leave feeling frustrated that I haven't had a chance to kind of grill them on the kind of stuff that I would grill them on if I was put in front of them.
So Tank Man, what was maybe the most epic, the most intense, or the most interesting story that he told you?
Well, I do remember him telling me, funny enough, it's not really about the conflict. I remember him telling me about the importance of letters. And there was this guy who literally every few weeks, post would arrive intermittently. There was no kind of sort of regular post. So it was supposed to be regular, but it didn't come out regularly. So you might suddenly get a flurry of 5 all in one day. But he said there was this guy, and in his tank, a member of a different tank troop. He was a good friend of his in the same squadron. British have squadrons for their armor, and which is Americans would have a company.
I should say that in your book, one of the wonderful things you do is you use the correct term in the language.
Yeah.
For the particular army involved, whether it's the German or the British or the American.
Well, that's not to be pretentious. That's really just to set it, because you're dealing with so many numbers and different units, and it can go over your head, and you can get sort of consumed by the detail if you're not careful. And as a reader, it can be very unsatisfying because you just can't keep pace with everything. So one of the things about writing in the vernacular German, or in the American spelling, Armor rather than Armauer, as we Brits would spell it, is it just immediately tells the reader, okay, this is an American, okay, I've got that, or this is German, I've got that, or Italian, or whatever it might be. But to go back to Sam. So Sam, there was this guy in his squadron, and he'd get his letters from his girlfriend, his wife, and he said it was like a soap opera. He said we all just waited for his letters to come in so we could find out, whether his daughter had, got to school okay or something, won the swimming contest or whatever it was. The sort of details of this sort of day-to-day kind of banal life was just absolute catnip to these guys. They absolutely loved it. And then the letter arrived, the Dear John letter, saying, sorry, I found someone else and it's over. And his friend was just absolutely devastated. It was the only thing that was keeping him going, this sort of sense of this sort of continuity of home, this sort of this foundation of his life back at home. And Sam said he could see he was in a really, really bad way. Mm-hmm. And he thought, he's going to do something stupid. And he went up to him and he said, look, I know it's bad and I know it's terrible and I know you're absolutely devastated, but you've got your mates here. Just don't do anything silly. Just, maybe, when it's all over, you can patch things up or sort things out. And he said, you've got to understand it from her point of view. It's a long way. You haven't seen you for 2 years, this kind of stuff, so just don't do anything rash. And of course, the next engagement, 2 days later, he was killed. And he said it was just a kind of, he just knew that was going to happen. So it was a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. That's something I've never forgotten, that story. And I just thought, it's about human drama. That's the truth of it. And how people react to this totally alien situation. For the most part, the Second World War is fought by ordinary, everyday people doing extraordinary things. And I think that's something that's so fascinating. I suspect, I think I'm quite slapdash, I think. So I think I'd have bought it, literally. I don't think it would have ended well for me. I'm just a bit careless.
Yeah. I think I also have an element in me where I can believe in the idea of nation and fight for a nation, especially when the conflict is as grand.
There are things worse than death.
Yes, as the propaganda would explain very clearly, but also in reality, yes. So a nation, France, Britain was, maybe facing the prospect of being essentially enslaved. The Soviet Union was facing the prospect of being enslaved, literally. I mean, it was very, very clearly stated what they're going to do. They're going to repopulate the land with Germanic people. So,
Well, they're not just going to do that; they're also going to starve lots and lots of Soviet individuals to death by the hunger plan, for example, which is planned, really very casually, and not by the, this is not SS units or anything like this. This is the Wehrmacht. This is the economic division of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German Combined General Staff. General Georg Thomas comes up with, and Hermann Bacher, they come up with who's the kind of minister for food. They come up, what are we going to do? We haven't got enough food, largely because German farming is inefficient. And they think, well, this is part of Lebensraum. We'll go in and we'll take the food. And there's been this colossal urbanization of the Soviet Union since the revolution in 1917. So they're just not going to get their food, these people in these cities, because we're going to take it all, and that's going to lead to a lot of deaths. Umpteen millions is the phrase that Georg Thomas used.
So let's talk about the hunger plan. How important was the hunger plan and Lebensraum to Nazi ideology and to the whole Nazi war machine?
It's central to the whole thing. This is all about this notion that is embedded into Hitler's mind and into the minds of the Nazi Party right from the word go, is there is a big sort of global conspiracy, the Jewish Bolshevik plot. I mean, completely misplaced that Jews and Bolsheviks go hand in hand and sort of somehow dovetail. They don't, obviously. And the whole ideology is to crush this. Part of the way the Nazis think, the way Hitler thinks, is there is a them and there's us. We are the whites, Northern European Aryans. We should be the master race. We've been threatened by a global Jewish Bolshevik plot. We've been stabbed in the back in 1918 at the end of the First World War. We need to have to overcome. This is an existential battle for future survival. It's a terrible task that has befallen our generation, but we have to do this. We have to overcome this, or else we have no future. We will be crushed. It's absolutely cut and dry. And one of the things about Hitler is that he is a very kind of black and white, them or us, either or kind of person. It's always one thing or the other. It's a 1,000-year Reich or it's Armageddon. There's no middle ground. There's no gray area. It's just one or the other. And that's his worldview. And the reason he came to the fore was because of the crystal clear clarity of his message, which is, we've been stabbed in the back. There is a global plot. We have to overcome this. We are naturally the master race. We have to reassert ourselves. We have to get rid of global Jewry. We have to get rid of global Bolshevism. And we have to prevail or else. But if we do prevail, what an amazing world it's going to be. So he starts with this, every speech he does always starts the same way. Always starts from a kind of negative and always ends with an incredible positive, this sort of rabble-rousing crescendo of if you're in the front row, spittle, halitosis, and gesticulation. I mean, you've seen pictures of him. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of him. It's like, he's almost, he wants to grab the air and clutch it to him. You can see the kind of the venom coming out of his mouth just in a single still photograph. I mean, it's amazing. There's apps you can get now where you can translate his speeches.
Mhm.
That just and it just sounds, by today's standards, you just think, what a load of absolute wibble. I mean, just total nonsense. But you have to kind of put yourself back in the shoes of people listening to him in 1922 or 23, or indeed 1933, and see how kind of captivating that is to a certain part of the population. So yes, so to go back to your original point, Lebensraum is absolutely part of it. So what you do is you crush the Bolsheviks, you crush world Jewry, then you expand. The Britain has had this incredible empire, global empire. Germany needs that too. Germany's stuck in Europe. It doesn't have access to the world's oceans. So we're not going to be a maritime empire. We're going to be a land mass empire, the whole of land mass of Europe and into Asia. That's going to be us. And we're going to take that land. We're going to take the breadbasket of Ukraine. We're going to use that for our own ends. We're going to spread we're going to make ourselves rich, but we're also going to spread our peoples. We're going to spread the Aryan northern master race throughout Europe and into the traditional Slavic areas, and we will prevail and come out on top. And so you have to understand that everything about Operation Barbarossa, the planned invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, is totally wrapped up in the Nazi ideology. And people, I've read it that historians sort of go, if only Hitler had realized that, the Ukrainians have been quite happy to kind of fight on his side. If only he'd actually brought some of these Jewish scientists and kind of into the Nazi fold, then Germany might have prevailed in World War II. And you kind of think, well, you're missing the entire point. That's just never going to happen because this is an ideological war.
Yeah, this is not a pragmatic, rational leader.
No.
I mean, part of his effectiveness, we should say, is probably this singular belief in this ideology. There's pros and cons. For an effective military machine, probably having that singular focus is effective.
Yes, except that when you're making military decisions, if those decisions are always being bracketed by an ideology which is fundamentally flawed from a pragmatic point of view as much as a kind of
ethical,
a kind of reasonable point of view, you're kind of opening yourselves up for trouble. I mean, this is a problem he has with Barbarossa. That they realized very early on in 1941 when they're wargaming this whole operation that it's not going to work. And so, there's people like General Paulus, who's on the general staff at the time. He's given a kind of, he's in charge of kind of wargaming this, and he goes, "This isn't going to work." And Keitel, who is the chief of the OKW, goes, "No, go back and make it work." He goes, "Okay." So he comes back with a plan that does work, but it's bogus. I mean, it doesn't work because they don't have enough. They don't have enough motorization. They go into Barbarossa with 2,000 different types of vehicle. But every single one of those vehicles has to have, different distributor caps and different leads and plugs and all sorts of different parts. There's the interoperability of the German mechanized arm is super inefficient. And so you've got huge problems because they kind of think, well, we took France in 1940, and that's kind of one of the most modern countries in the world with, one of the greatest armies and armed forces in the world. And we did that in 6 weeks. So, Soviet Union, look, they struggled against Finland, for goodness sake. I mean, how hard can it be? But what you're failing to understand is that attacking the Soviet Union is over a geographical landmass 10 times the size of France, just on the frontage. And you haven't really got much more mechanization than you had in May 1940 when they attacked the Low Countries in France. And you've actually got less Luftwaffe aircraft to support you. And you just do not have the operational mechanics to make it work successfully. I mean, it is largely down to incompetence of the Red Army and the Soviet leadership in the summer of 1941 that they get as far as they do. I mean, Barbarossa should never have come close to being a victory.
Let's talk through it. So Operation Barbarossa that you're mentioning, and we'll go back.
Yes,
to
we
39
jumped
and
straight
40,
into 41.
straight into it.
I've eaten off 2 years of war.
So this is June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, when Hitler invades the Soviet Union with, I think, the largest invading force in history up to that point.
Collectively, yeah.
And there's 3 prongs: Army Group North, Army Group Center, Army Group South. North is going to Leningrad. Center is going, it's the strongest group going directly towards Moscow.
Mm-hmm.
And South is going and targeting Ukraine and the Caucasus. So can you linger on that, on the details of this plan? What was the thinking? What was the strategy? What was the tactics? What was the logistics? There's so many things to say, but one of them is to say that you often emphasize the importance of 3 ways to analyze military conflict: of the strategic, the operational, and tactical. And operational is often not given enough time, attention, and it's the logistics that make the war machine really work successfully or fail.
Yeah, that's absolutely spot on. And it's interesting because the vast majority of general histories of World War II tend to focus on the strategic and the tactical. So what do I mean by that? Well, the strategic, just for those who don't know, that's your overall war aims. Get to Moscow, whatever it might be, conquer the world. That's your strategy. The tactical side of things that's the coalface of war. That's the attritional bit. That's the fellow in his Spitfire, the tank crew, the soldier in his foxhole. It's the actual kinetic fighting bit. The operational bit is the level of war that links the strategic to the tactical. So it is absolutely factories. It's economics, it's shipping, it's supply chains, it's how you manage your war. And one of the things where I think people have been guilty in the past, historians have been guilty in the past, is by judging warfare all on the same level. But obviously every competent nation has a different approach to war because of the nation they are, the size they are, their geographical location. So Britain, for example, is an island nation. Its priority is the Royal Navy, which is why the Royal Navy is known as the senior service. And, in 1939, it's easy to forget it now when you see how depleted Britain is today. But in 1939, it has comfortably the world's largest navy. Something like 194 destroyers. I think it's 15 battleships, 7 aircraft carriers, and another kind of 6 on the way. America, it's got Pacific Ocean, it's got the Atlantic Ocean, it's got 2 seaboards. It has the second largest navy in the world, but a tiny army. I mean, the U.S. Army in September 1939 is the 19th largest in the world, sandwiched between Portugal and Uruguay. And it's just incredible. It's like 189,000 strong, which might seem reasonably large by today's standards, but is absolutely tiny by 1939 standards. Whereas, Germany's got an army of, 3.5 million in 1939. So, these are big, big, big differences. But America's coming at it from a different perspective. Britain's coming at it from a different perspective. Britain's empire is all about, it's a shipping, it's a seaborne empire. Whereas there's also another point, which is having large armies is actually inherently impractical and inefficient, because the larger the army, the more people you've got to feed, the more kind of barracks you've got to have, the more space you've got to have for training, the more people you're taking out of your workforce to produce tanks and shells and all the rest of it, because they're tramping around with rifles. So there's an argument saying actually it's really not a very good way of doing things. So, very much the British way and subsequently the United States way and the way of Britain's dominions and empire is to use kind of steel, not our flesh, as a principle. The idea is that you use technology, mechanization, modernity, global reach to do a lot of your hard yards. That's the sort of basic principle behind the strategic air campaign. When we talk about the strategic air campaign, we're talking about strategic air forces which are operating in isolation from other armed forces. So a tactical air force, for example, is an air force which is offering close air support for ground operations. A strategic air force has got nothing to do with ground operations. It's just operating on its own. So that's your bomber force or whatever. That's your B-17s and B-24s of the 8th Air Force flying out of East England, bombing the Ruhr industrial complex of Germany or whatever it might be. So it's important to understand that when you compare, you have to have in the back of your mind that Britain, compared to Germany, for example, is coming at it from a completely different perspective. Mm-hmm. And I would say one of the failures of Hitler is that he always views everybody through his own very narrow worldview, which is not particularly helpful. You want to get inside the head of your enemy. And, he's sort of guilty of not doing that. So when you're talking about Operation Barbarossa, to go back to your original question, Lex, you're dealing with an operation on such a vast scale that operational level of war is absolutely vital to its chances of success or failure. It doesn't matter how good your individual commanders are at the front. If you haven't got the backup, it's not going to work. And the problem that the Germans have is, yes, they've got their kind of, 3 million men on the front, and they've got their kind of, 3,000 aircraft and all the rest of it. But actually, what you need to do is break it down. And who is doing the hard yards of that? And the way the German war machine works is that the machine bit is only the spearhead. So people always talk about the Nazi war machine. In a way, it's a kind of misnomer because you're sort of suggesting that it's highly mechanized and industrialized and all the rest of it. And nothing could be further from the truth. The spearhead is, but the rest of it is not. And this is the kind of fatal flaw of the German armed forces in the whole of World War II, really, but even in this early stage, because in Barbarossa, you're talking about 17 panzer divisions out of, the 100-odd that are involved in the initial attack. Well, 17, and that a panzer division is not a division full of panzers, tanks. It is a combined arms motorized outfit. So scouts on BMWs with sidecars, armored cars, infantry, grenadiers, panzer grenadiers, which are infantry in half tracks, and trucks, mechanized. It is motorized artillery. It is motorized anti-aircraft artillery. It is motorized anti-tank artillery. And of course, it is tanks as well, panzers. But those are a really, really small proportion of, you're talking less than 20% of your attacking force are those spearhead forces. And inevitably, they are going to be attrited as they go. You are going to take casualties. And not only that, you're not going to just take battlefield casualties, you're also going to have mechanical casualties because of the huge spaces involved. You just simply can't function. So what you see is in the initial phases of Operation Barbarossa, they surge forward. Red Army's got absolutely no answers to anything. Stalin weirdly hasn't heeded all the warnings that this attack is brewing, and there have been plenty, incidentally. Smolensk falls on the 15th of July, in less than 4 weeks. It's just incredible. 3.5 weeks, Smolensk has gone. They've overwhelmed the rest of what had been Poland. They've surged into what is now Belarus, taken Smolensk, this is Army Group Center. Army Group North is thrust up into the Baltic. It's all going swimmingly well. But then the next several months, they barely go 100 miles. And that's because they're running out of steam. And the 16th Panzer Division, for example, by the time it's taken Smolensk, involved in taking Smolensk on the 15th of July 1941, the following day, it's got 16 tanks left. 16 out of, should have 180. So it's just being attrited. They can't sustain it. And they can't sustain it because as the Russians fall back, as the Soviet Red Army falls back, they did their own scorched earth policy. They also discover that the railway line is kind of a different loading gauge, so they've got to change it. So the Russian loading gauge is slightly wider. So every single mile, every yard, every foot, every meter of they're capturing of Russian railway has to be moved a couple of inches to the left to make it fit the German Kriegslok and the standard train of locomotive of the Reichsbahn. Just imagine what that's like. And also Soviet trains are bigger, so they can take more water, which means the water stops in between are fewer and far between. So the Germans, when they come in, their trains, their Kriegslok are smaller, so they have to be rewatered more often and recoaled more often. So they have to, I mean, it's absolutely boggling just how complicated it is and how badly planned it is, because they haven't reckoned on this. They're having to kind of think on their feet.
I love the the logistical details of all of this, because yes, that's a huge component of this, especially when you're covering that much territory. But there is a notion that if Hitler didn't stop Army Group Center, it could have pushed all the way to Moscow. It was only maybe 100 miles away from Moscow. Is that a possibility? Because it had so much success in the early days pushing forward. Do you think it's possible that if Hitler, as we mentioned, from a military blunder perspective, didn't make that blunder, that they could have defeated the Soviet Union right there and then?
Well, my own view is that they should never have got close. Red Army has plenty of men to be able to see off anything that the Germans can do. The capture of Kyiv, for example, in September 1941, was a catastrophe for the Soviet Union and should never have happened. I mean, Zhukov is saying to Stalin, "We got to pull back across the Dnieper." Stalin's going, "No, can't possibly do that. You can't abandon Kyiv. It's like the third city in the Soviet Union. No way. No, absolutely not." And he goes, "Well, we are just going to be overwhelmed. We can't hold this." And he says, "Either back me or fire me, back me or sack me." So Stalin sacks him. Obviously, as we know, Zhukov gets rehabilitated in pretty quick order, and Stalin does learn very quickly thereafter to learn the lessons.